Okay, so you sent over a ton of stuff on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust,
Yeah.
YouTube videos, transcripts, the whole works.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to kind of unpack how the Nazis convinced an entire nation to participate in the genocide of millions.
Right.
And we're going to understand the psychology of hate, the power of propaganda, and the steps that led to one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Yeah, it's
This is going to be intense.
it is going to be intense, yeah.
But incredibly important.
It's what's fascinating to me is how the Nazi regime, they didn't just seize power and unleash this horror.
Right.
It was methodical. They manipulated public opinion.
Yeah.
They exploited pre-existing prejudices.
Uh-huh.
And they did it all in stages.
Yeah.
So we're going to trace that progression from that subtle propaganda to outright terror.
Okay, so let's start with Hitler himself.
Oh, okay.
His hatred for Jewish people was no secret.
No, not at all.
Right.
Hitler's anti-Semitism wasn't just some personal quirk. It was a fundamental part of his ideology. Even back in the 1920s, when he was just starting his political career, he was already publicly blaming Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I, for the economic struggles, for everything wrong in the country.
Right.
He painted them as this parasitic force undermining German society,
Yeah.
a threat to what he called Aryan purity.
So he's laying this groundwork, setting the stage for the Holocaust, even before he's in a position of real power.
Exactly. He's planting these seeds of hatred,
Right.
creating a scapegoat that he can exploit later on.
Ah,
And it's important to remember the context here.
okay.
Germany, after World War I, was a nation in turmoil,
Yeah.
humiliated,
Yeah.
economically devastated.
Mm-hmm.
People were desperate for answers, for someone to blame.
Yeah,
Hitler offered them that scapegoat,
right.
and he did it with a charisma and a conviction that resonated with a lot of people.
And once he gains power, he wastes no time turning this rhetoric into action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Nazis, once they are in control, begin systematically stripping Jews of their rights. They're banned from professions, their businesses are boycotted, they're stripped of their citizenship.
Wow.
It's a step-by-step process of dehumanization, making it easier for ordinary Germans to accept the escalating persecution.
Right.
And this is where the stab-in-the-back myth comes in.
Oh, right. I remember that term.
Yeah.
Remind me about that one.
So this was the idea, widely propagated by the Nazis, that Germany hadn't actually lost World War I on the battlefield,
Uh-huh.
but had been betrayed by internal enemies,
Okay.
namely Jews and communists.
Right.
This myth resonated deeply with many Germans who were struggling to come to terms with the defeat and who were looking for someone to blame.
So the Nazis are exploiting this pre-existing resentment, twisting it to their advantage.
Exactly. They were masters of propaganda, of tapping into existing fears and prejudices, amplifying them.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just speeches and rallies.
Right.
They understood the power of visuals, of spectacle.
Yeah. One of the sources mentioned the film The Eternal Jew. It's chilling how blatantly they portrayed Jews as these vermin, these disease-carrying rats.
Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was a master of this.
Yeah.
He understood that film could bypass rational thought
Right?
and tap directly into people's emotions.
Wow.
The Eternal Jew wasn't meant to be a documentary.
Right.
It was meant to evoke disgust,
Yeah.
fear, to make people see Jews as something less than human.
And that's how they start normalizing the unthinkable, right?
Exactly.
If you can convince people that a certain group is inherently dangerous, subhuman,
Right.
then it becomes easier to justify treating them inhumanely.
Precisely. It's a gradual process, but each step builds on the last.
Yeah.
And each one makes the next step a little bit easier to take.
Right.
The Nazis weren't just killing people, they were creating a culture where that killing could seem justified, even necessary.
It's terrifying how effective they were at shifting blame, making it seem like the Jews were somehow responsible for their own fate.
Oh, absolutely. This was key to their strategy. They needed to convince ordinary Germans that what they were doing was not only acceptable,
Right.
but was actually in their best interest. They needed to deflect any sense of guilt or responsibility.
Yeah.
And they did this by constantly hammering home the message that the Jews were a threat, a danger to Germany's very existence.
Okay, so they've laid this groundwork of hate.
Yeah.
They're using propaganda to dehumanize Jews.
Right.
But the Holocaust itself, the systematic mass murder, that didn't start right away.
No, it didn't.
Most did it.
It was a gradual escalation.
Yeah.
Before they turned their full attention to the Jews, they tested their methods, their machinery of death,
Okay.
on another group.
You're talking about the T4 euthanasia program.
Yes?
The one where they killed disabled children and adults.
Yes, this program, launched in 1939, was shrouded in secrecy.
Right.
They used deceptive language,
Yeah.
talking about mercy killings and releasing people from their suffering. They even issued fake death certificates, creating this illusion of normalcy.
One of the sources mentioned that parents were actually tricked into sending their children to these care centers.
Right.
It's hard to believe people could be so easily deceived.
But that's the power of propaganda,
Yeah.
of manipulating language and exploiting people's trust.
Yeah.
And remember, this was still relatively early in the Nazi regime. Many Germans were still willing to give them the benefit of the doubt.
So the T4 program was a testing ground,
Exactly.
a way for the Nazis to gauge public tolerance for mass killing and to refine their methods.
Exactly. It was a chillingly efficient system of murder using lethal injections in gas chambers.
Right.
And the lack of widespread public outcry to this program, that was a green light for the Nazis.
Yeah.
A sign that they could get away with even more.
It's like they were desensitizing themselves and the German public to the idea of mass killing,
Yes.
one horrifying step at a time.
And the T4 program also provided them with the personnel, the infrastructure, the expertise in killing that they would later apply to the Holocaust. This wasn't some sudden eruption of violence.
No.
It was a calculated, methodical process.
It culminates in the Wannsee Conference in 1942.
Right.
The meeting where they basically lay out the logistics of the final solution.
Reinhard Heydrich, a top SS official, brings together key figures from various government ministries to coordinate the mass deportation and extermination of Jews from all over German-occupied Europe.
Right.
The minutes from this meeting are chilling.
Yeah.
They talk about evacuation and special treatment.
Right.
These euphemisms designed to mask the horrifying reality of what they're planning.
It's like they were trying to sanitize genocide to distance themselves from the horror of it.
And it's not just the language.
Yeah.
They also go to great lengths to deceive the victims themselves.
There's a resettlement to the east, deception.
Exactly. Jews are told they're being sent to work camps, that they'll need to bring their belongings, their tools.
Wow.
They're even made to buy train tickets to create this illusion of a normal relocation. The Nazis understand the importance of maintaining a facade of order,
Right.
of keeping things running smoothly.
And they were meticulous in their planning, weren't they?
Oh, yeah.
One of the sources talked about the Nazis' obsession with logistics,
Yes.
with making the whole process as efficient as possible.
It's chilling how they applied their organizational skills to mass murder. They had a plan for everything, transporting millions of people across Europe, building death camps, disposing of the bodies.
Wow.
It was a bureaucratic nightmare. They managed to make it work.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so horrifying.
And that brings us to the death camps themselves.
Yes.
Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka.
Right.
These names have become synonymous with the Holocaust places, specifically designed for efficient mass killing.
These were factories of death hidden away in the forests of Poland.
Right.
And the chilling thing is the expertise they gained from the T4 program was directly applied here. The methods, the personnel, even some of the key figures like Christian Worth. They all transitioned from killing disabled people to killing Jews.
So these camps weren't just about killing people.
Right.
They were designed to dehumanize and degrade them before they were murdered.
Absolutely.
The process itself was meant to be as traumatic and humiliating as possible.
From the moment they arrived, prisoners were stripped of their identities, their belongings, their hair, everything that made them human.
Jeez.
They were reduced to numbers, treated like cattle being herded to slaughter.
Right.
The entire process was designed to break their spirit, to make them feel utterly powerless.
And the scale of this operation, the sheer number of people involved, it's mind-boggling.
That's what makes the Holocaust so disturbing.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the work of a few fanatical leaders.
Right.
It required the complicity of countless individuals and institutions.
Right.
Government ministries, the railroads, corporations, ordinary German citizens. They all played a role.
I remember one source talking about companies like IG Farben that profited from slave labor in the camps. Train drivers transported millions to their deaths. Civil servants stamped paperwork, processed documents.
Yeah.
It's like the entire German state was mobilized to facilitate this genocide.
And that's where the concept of just following orders comes into play.
Right.
The Nazis created a system where individuals could compartmentalize their actions, distancing themselves from the moral implications of what they were doing.
Wow.
It's a terrifying example of how easily people can become cogs in a machine, even a machine of death.
But wasn't there any resistance?
There were.
Surely some people must have tried to stop it.
There were isolated acts of resistance, individuals who risked their lives to hide Jews, to sabotage the Nazi machine. There was even a protest in Berlin, the Rosenstrasse protest, where non-Jewish women successfully demanded the release of their Jewish husbands.
So there were flickers of humanity, moments of courage, even in the darkest of times.
Yes.
But overall, the resistance was limited, wasn't it?
Yes, tragically it was. Fear, propaganda, self-preservation, these all played a role in the widespread silence and complicity.
Right.
It's a sobering reminder that even in a supposedly civilized society, horrific things can happen when good people choose to do nothing. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Even amidst the chaos and brutality of war, this meticulously planned genocide was unfolding.
Yeah.
And it raises a difficult question.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if the Nazis were so obsessed with exterminating the Jews, why didn't they devote all their resources to it? Why fight a world war at the same time?
Right.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does seem like a strange contradiction. Were they so confident of victory that they thought they could handle both?
That's part of it.
Okay.
Hitler's ideology was built on this belief in the superiority of the Aryan race and their destiny to rule over inferior peoples. He saw the war as a way to achieve this, to create a vast empire in Eastern Europe where the conquered populations would be enslaved and the Jews eradicated.
So the Holocaust and the war were intertwined, both driven by this warped worldview.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that the Nazis weren't just fighting the Jews.
Right.
They were waging war against multiple enemies on multiple fronts.
Right. The Soviets in the East, the British and Americans in the West.
Exactly.
It was a global conflict.
And that's where the Nazis' ambitions ultimately led to their downfall. They overreached, spreading themselves too thin, trying to fight everyone at once.
Okay, so let's talk about the war itself.
Okay.
One of the sources mentioned the blitzkrieg tactics.
Right.
This lightning-fast style of warfare that allowed the Germans to conquer much of Europe so quickly.
Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war, was a revolutionary military doctrine that emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force.
Okay.
They combined tanks, aircraft, and infantry in a coordinated assault, punching through enemy lines and creating chaos.
It sounds terrifyingly effective.
It was, at least initially.
Yeah.
The fall of Poland in 1939, then Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France in 1940, it all happened so quickly. The world was stunned by the speed and ferocity of the German advance.
But they weren't able to conquer Britain, were they? The Battle of Britain with the Luftwaffe bombing London and other cities.
Right.
That was a turning point, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over England in 1940, was a crucial test of strength. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, tried to bomb the British into submission.
Right.
But the Royal Air Force fought back with incredible courage and determination.
And they had radar, right?
Yes.
That new technology that allowed them to detect incoming German bombers.
Radar was a game changer.
Yeah.
It gave the British early warning of Luftwaffe raids, allowing them to scramble their fighter planes and intercept the bombers before they could reach their targets.
Wow.
It was a crucial factor in the British victory.
And this victory, it showed that the Nazis weren't invincible.
Right.
That they could be defeated.
Yeah.
It must have been a huge morale boost for the Allies.
It was. The Battle of Britain was a turning point in the war. It dashed Hitler's hopes of a quick victory and forced him to turn his attention elsewhere.
And that elsewhere was the Soviet Union, wasn't it?
Yes.
Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Right.
That was a colossal gamble for Hitler, wasn't it?
A colossal gamble that ultimately backfired.
Yeah.
Hitler believed he could conquer the Soviet Union in a matter of months.
Wow.
Just like he had done with France.
Right.
He underestimated the size and resilience of the Soviet Union, the vastness of their territory, and the determination of their people.
And the Russian winter, right?
Yes.
The Germans weren't prepared for the brutal cold.
The weather played a huge role in the German defeat.
Yeah.
Their equipment froze, their supply lines stretched thin, and they were constantly harassed by Soviet partisans.
And the Battle of Stalingrad?
Right.
That was a turning point on the Eastern Front, wasn't it?
It was.
A brutal, months-long siege that resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Germans.
Stalingrad was a turning point in the war.
Yeah.
It was a horrific battle, a city reduced to rubble with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed on both sides.
Wow.
The German defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of their long retreat from the east.
So while all this is happening in Europe,
Yes.
Japan is waging war in the Pacific.
Right. Japan's expansionist ambitions in Asia and the Pacific ultimately led to their clash with the United States.
The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that brought America into the war, didn't it?
It did. It was a calculated gamble by the Japanese, hoping to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and allow them to consolidate their control over Southeast Asia.
And it worked, at least initially.
It did.
The Japanese achieved stunning victories in the early months of the war,
Yes.
conquering vast territories and inflicting heavy losses on the Allies.
They were masters of naval warfare and jungle fighting.
Yeah.
But like the Germans, they underestimated the resolve of their enemies. The attack on Pearl Harbor awakened a sleeping giant.
The American people were outraged, weren't they?
They were.
It unified the nation and fueled their determination to fight back.
Absolutely. And the United States had a vast industrial capacity that Japan simply couldn't match.
Right.
They were able to outproduce the Japanese in terms of ships, planes, tanks, everything.
So the tide began to turn, didn't it?
It did.
With key battles like Midway and Guadalcanal.
Midway was a decisive naval victory for the U.S., crippling Japan's carrier fleet and shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. Guadalcanal was a brutal, months-long battle for control of a strategically important island.
Right.
It was a turning point in the Pacific War, demonstrating the U.S. Marines' tenacity and their ability to fight and win against a determined enemy.
And let's not forget the role of code breaking.
Yes.
One of the sources mentioned how the Allies had broken both the German and Japanese codes,
Right.
giving them a huge advantage in the war.
Code breaking played a crucial role in the Allied victory.
Yeah.
It allowed them to anticipate enemy movements, disrupt supply lines, and plan their own operations more effectively.
Wow.
The ability to decipher enemy communications was a game changer.
It's amazing how this seemingly invisible war, fought by mathematicians and cryptographers, could have such a profound impact on the outcome of the conflict.
It highlights the importance of intelligence gathering and analysis in modern warfare.
Right.
Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on the battlefield, but in the shadows, in the realm of intelligence and deception.
So the war raged on, both in Europe and the Pacific, with millions of lives lost and entire cities reduced to rubble.
Yes.
But even amidst the chaos and bloodshed, the Holocaust continued.
Yes, as the Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the Nazis ramped up their efforts to exterminate the Jews. They knew their time was running out, and they were determined to complete their horrific mission.
This is where the death marches come in, right?
Exactly.
The forced evacuations of prisoners from camps in the east as the Soviets advanced.
Exactly. The Nazis didn't want the Soviets to liberate the camps and discover the evidence of their crimes.
Right.
So they forced prisoners on these brutal marches, often in the dead of winter, with little food or clothing.
Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, or were simply murdered along the way.
It was a final act of barbarity, a desperate attempt to cover up their crimes and kill as many Jews as possible before the war ended.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom the depths of cruelty the Nazis were capable of, even in the face of defeat.
Yeah.
But as the Allies advanced, they couldn't hide the truth forever.
No. The liberation of the camps started to expose the horrific reality of the Holocaust to the world.
Right.
The Soviet troops were the first to encounter these scenes of unimaginable horror.
I remember one source described the liberation of Majdanek.
Yeah.
The Soviet soldiers were completely unprepared for what they found.
Can you imagine you're a soldier fighting your way across Europe and you come across a place like Majdanek?
Yeah.
The gas chambers, the crematoria.
Right.
Piles of shoes, eyeglasses, human hair,
Right.
the stench of death hanging heavy in the air.
Yeah.
It was evidence of a crime so monstrous it defied comprehension.
And as the Allies pushed further into Germany, they liberated more camps. Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau.
Right.
Each one revealing the systematic nature of the Nazis' extermination plan.
The scale of it all, the sheer industrial efficiency of the killing, it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
These weren't just random acts of violence. This
Right.
was a meticulously planned and executed genocide with every detail carefully considered.
It's difficult to process, isn't it?
It is.
The idea that human beings could be capable of such calculated cruelty.
It forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature.
Yeah.
The Holocaust is a stark reminder of what can happen when hate and indifference are allowed to take root.
But even in the midst of this horror, there were stories of survival, of resilience. Some managed to escape the camps.
Yeah.
Others were liberated just in time.
Yes, and the testimonies of these survivors are incredibly important. They give us a glimpse into the human cost of this genocide. The individual stories behind the staggering statistics.
They remind us that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, the human spirit can endure.
Absolutely. And these stories also serve as a powerful reminder that the fight against hate and intolerance is an ongoing one.
Right.
The lessons of the Holocaust are as relevant today as they ever were.
Okay, so the war is ending, the Nazi regime is collapsing.
Right.
What happens next?
Well,
How do the Allies deal with the aftermath of this horrific crime?
there's a sense of urgency to document everything, to gather evidence of the crimes that were committed.
Right.
The Allies are determined to hold the perpetrators accountable.
And that leads to the Nuremberg trials, right?
Yes.
The first international tribunal to prosecute individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The Nuremberg trials were a landmark moment in international law. They established the principle that individuals, regardless of their rank or position, could be held responsible for their actions, even in times of war.
It was a way of saying never again, wasn't it?
It was.
The world was determined to ensure that such atrocities would never be repeated.
The trials were a powerful symbol of justice and accountability.
Yeah.
But they were also a recognition of the complexities of complicity, of collective responsibility.
Right.
It wasn't just about punishing the top Nazi leaders.
Right.
It was about acknowledging the widespread involvement of individuals and institutions in the machinery of the Holocaust.
It's a heavy legacy, isn't it?
It is.
One that continues to shape our understanding of international law and human rights to this day.
Absolutely. The Holocaust was a turning point in human history, and its impact continues to resonate across the globe.
Yeah.
It's a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of civilization,
Right.
and the urgent need to combat hate and intolerance in all its forms.
This deep dive has been incredibly intense, but so important.
It has.
I'm still grappling with the scale of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
the calculated cruelty, the millions of lives lost.
It's not easy to confront this history, but it's essential that we do, remembering the victims, understanding how such horrors could happen. That's how we honor their memory and work to prevent such atrocities from happening again.
So after all this, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is the recognition that the Holocaust wasn't inevitable.
Right.
It was the result of choices,
Yeah.
of individuals and institutions choosing to embrace hate, to turn a blind eye to injustice, to participate in the persecution of the fellow human beings.
Right.
And that means we have the power to choose differently.
Yeah.
We can choose to challenge prejudice, to speak out against injustice, to build a world where such horrors are never repeated. It's a responsibility we all share.
Well said, and thank you to our listener for sending in this incredibly important topic for us to explore. We'll see you on our next deep dive.